Silent Hill 4 is a survival horror game developed by Konami and Team Silent and released in 2004 for the PS2. I played the PC port. You play as Henry Townsend, a reserved and introverted resident of room 302 of South Ashfield Heights. One day he finds himself trapped in room 302. The windows and doors are locked shut, and no one in the apartment complex can hear him. Shortly after, a hole is discovered in his bathroom, leading him to another world filled with nightmares and monsters. The premise of the room's really creative and stood out to me. I haven't played anything else that contains the same feeling. It's a more subtle, intimate type of fear that takes a familiar and usually safe setting of a person's home and twists it into something unknown. You aren't in any immediate danger, but in the back of your mind you know something's wrong. I think it's great motivation to explore the other world and make it out alive. The room becomes an area that you will return to in order to save, solve puzzles, and gather information and story through notes slipped under the front door. There's a truly eerie feeling spending so much time in the room as the world keeps moving on without you, being so close but so far away from reality. Different events happen over time during each visit back to the room. Visiting the room was enough to take a short breath of relief from the other world. In the first half of the game in the room you can heal, but there's still that lingering sense of unrest due to the unpredictable events of the room. The room features a first-person perspective, and the other world is a third-person one. The first-person perspective is slow and intimate, while the other world's third-person perspective provides you with dangerous survival horror exploration. The juxtaposition of these two perspectives creates a unique feeling of tension as traveling between the two areas starts to feel routine. The first thing I noticed when playing this game is how linear it felt compared to the other Silent Hill games. The worlds themselves are open, but the way you travel between them to progress is more like moving from level to level. I actually didn't mind the more linear approach. I wasn't sure how to feel in the earlier parts of the game, but things made more sense during the second half as the story progressed. Instead of a huge map filled with smaller locations, you travel to different small worlds that are separated from one another. These areas are filled with useful key items, health, stronger temporary and permanent weapons, and other helpful equipment items, including optional ones. This encourages you to explore every corner of each world. While most of the areas aren't very large, the pace of the gameplay and navigating the areas still found a way to feel a bit slow. There's a fair 50-50 mix of puzzles I liked and puzzles I didn't like. Something really cool is that when you take a break and return to the room, there's a chance that a note will be left by the front door, either providing you with a hint or expanding the story. This was really cool as I was being fed more details bit by bit and encouraged to revisit the room for its utilities, survival, and puzzle-solving purposes. The best puzzles were the ones that required you to interact with the room in some way. Other puzzles had me stumped because I either didn't look in a specific area that didn't really stand out to me, didn't have a complete grasp of the puzzle mechanic, or in the most extreme case, like with the second building world, the puzzle included moving items from one place to another that didn't share any kind of mechanic relation to one another, and resulted in unlocking a door that I couldn't even tell was a locked door. Something that ruined the survival horror feel of the game for me was the fact that the room healed you when you're in it. This is so counterproductive to the survival horror genre. There are a lot of return holes back to the room too, so at any time if you're low on health, you can return there without consequence. There's still health pickups in the game, and this devalues the survival and scavenging aspects. Thankfully, the room only heals you for the first half of the game, and it's wrapped up into the story in an interesting way, which makes it a little less disappointing. I think you could convey the same message and still nerf how helpful the room is. Maybe put a timer on how often you can heal, or limit the amount of times you can heal, or maybe heal for a partial amount instead of back to full. Also, you just heal automatically. Adding an action like rinsing your face in the kitchen sink or drinking juice that's in the fridge would work a bit better. It would be a small change, but it would continue strengthening your interactions with the room and your routine in and out of it. You could even add more scares and events that way, like blood coming from the sink, or having the juice disappear during one trip to have it return again the next. I think this game's combat is the perfect marriage of clunky but effective. I see value in fixed camera angles and clunky combat when playing survival horror games. They limit the player so that they don't feel too strong. Ideally, the game should teach you to be smart with your health and resources, and that not every encounter should be fought. Sometimes it's safer to run. Henry will use melee weapons, firearms, and other helpful items. In order to attack, you need to enter a combat stance, then press the attack button. While in the combat stance, you will automatically focus and face the closest target, and can also evade a short distance to the sides. You can charge your melee attack for more damage. It feels really good to get the first strike with a charged melee attack, because they have a good chance of knocking down the enemy. Downed enemies will be vulnerable to stomps for extra damage. You have a small window to block and take reduced damage. While all of these options sound really useful, they're really slow. Your options being slow is good because you have the tools to succeed, but you still have to be smart on how you approach the combat and choose the best option for each interaction. Not to mention, you could always be outnumbered, in which case running might be the safest option. If you are being careful and do pick correct options, the combat can feel really rewarding. I really hate to say it, but every other part of the game that mixes with this combat system makes the game too easy. Enemies are really passive, they take a long time before they attack, and attacks are usually slow. Enemies will come at you one at a time in some cases. The corridors in the game are too wide, giving you too much space to avoid enemies. There were only 2 bosses in the game, one of them being the final boss. Bosses are important in survival horror to test the player and also drain their resources. The fact that there was only 1 boss before the end of the game, combined with the fact that the room heals you in the first half, means that there wasn't a whole lot of inventory management. Separate difficulty settings for combat and puzzles is not a thing in Silent Hill 4. Changing the combat difficulty also affects the difficulty of puzzles, so I can't even recommend hard mode because the puzzles get much more cryptic. Another unique aspect of Silent Hill 4 I loved is the recurring ghost enemies. There exists a finite amount of ghost enemies that are each their own person, sometimes with their own behaviors. They have relevancy in the story, so it's cool to see the blending of story and gameplay. The ghosts appear through walls and chase Henry down. They can directly attack or do damage just by being close to Henry. Ghosts cannot be killed. The game will give you the tools to temporarily down a ghost, but they are extremely rare. You can find saint medallions that make ghosts slower, and they won't deal damage unless they directly attack you, silver bullets that instantly incapacitate them for a short time, and swords of obedience that when you approach a downed ghost can impale and immobilize a ghost until the swords pick back up. The problem is, there are only 3 silver bullets and 5 swords of obedience in the game that you must find first, so if found you must use them wisely. How the ghosts are used in the game and the inventory management of items associated with them are some of the most unique and interesting aspects of this game. It's such a big reward finding such scarcely available items, and it takes a lot of active thinking to figure out when and where to use these items effectively. At least, that's what I think the goal of this system was. The truth is, this system needs to be rebalanced or fleshed out more. I complained about the easy difficulty earlier, but the ghosts don't quite fix this problem either. They became an inconvenience rather than being scary, and the tools to deal with them were extremely too scarce. In most, if not all situations, it's not even worth the effort to deal with them. They have a lot of health when trying to down them with normal means, and since they do damage when you're near them, and since you're also in danger of direct attacks, it's usually not worth it to try to down them. I love the idea of being able to incapacitate ghosts with the Sword of Obedience. Look around the environment safely, grab what you need, then retrieve the sword. However, you usually aren't in any space for a long period of time, so it's not worth the trouble in that regard either. I think either making it easier to use the swords, or providing a better incentive to incapacitate the ghosts would be a good direction. Right now it's too risky to fight the ghosts, making me not want to engage with them or the complementing mechanics at all. I like how you need to search for the swords, but they don't do anything else besides helping with ghosts. I think it would be cool to have to use these swords in the final fight, and have you rewarded with a better ending that way. That would reward the exploration by both making you stronger with access to swords, and access to more story. The swords are also a bit confusing to use. Since you can't equip it as a weapon, after stunning the ghost you need to stand by it and select the sword when it's highlighted. Because I wasn't always sure when the ghost was knocked down for just a second, or stunned and ready to use the sword, I kept fumbling through the menus too early to use the sword, and took damage because of it. It's not a great thing, but a lot of the game's content gets reused and repurposed. You'll spend the second half of the game revisiting areas you previously visited with small changes. I thought the second trip through the game's areas was a neat opportunity due to the story, but there wasn't enough done to make the experience actually worth it. Due to the story, the motivations and goals drastically change. The first time you travel through these seemingly unrelated areas, you're playing defense trying to escape. But during the second trip, you start to see how these areas are related to one another, and are on the offense, going deeper into the nightmare to stop it at its source. This narrative change made it feel like I made a lot of progress since the start of the game. The room also continued to change in interesting ways during the later parts, strengthening the transformation of a familiar and safe place into something else. Overall, I like the story. Despite being simple, the way it was presented and the way it comes together kept me interested from beginning to end. The second half of the game includes escorting another character through the other world, and I think it was handled well. You're traveling through familiar areas, but need to navigate them in different ways. The escortee can take damage, but they cannot die, and if given a weapon they can protect themselves pretty well. Word of warning to those looking to get the good ending. Since I saw the escortee couldn't die, I didn't worry too much about protecting them. But the less damage they take, the easier it is to complete the final task, and if they take too much damage, you could be locked out of being able to complete that last task. The only thing I would change is adding a more lenient distance that the NPC can follow you through load doors. There were a lot of times I went through a load screen, my escortee was missing, so I had to walk back through, load, and have them catch up and just return back through the door. Generally, the game's visuals look fine. My problem with the visuals is for a survival horror game and a Silent Hill game, it's entirely too bright. I wanted to keep the comparisons to a minimum, but when you look at the other Silent Hill games, 1, 2, or 3, and see just how dark and creepy they are, it shows how the sound design, visuals, and enemies all support each other to provide a cohesive and oppressive atmosphere. Compared to 4, it's no competition. There's a few spooky locations, but the majority of the game's locations are unchanged and stagnant, like the subway, forest, and prisons. No area in particular left a lasting impression. I think the enemy designs are hit and miss. There's some really cool enemies like Twin Victim, a two-headed monster that creepily points at Henry before attacking, and Hummers, which are small bugs that swoop in and out to attack. Then you have monsters like the Brute Scumhead, wheelchairs, yes, just actual wheelchairs, and the Patient, a tall humanoid with a pipe that burps when you attack it. This game uses a lot of weak sound design for its enemies. For example, sniffer dogs make stock jaguar screams, Hummers just sound like generic flies, and the above-mentioned Patients just burp. I again hate to compare it to the other games, but Silent Hill 2 and 3 have enemies that make loud, oppressive, unique noises, and they can be heard from far away, creating a much stronger scene. Sounds are really important for making memorable moments. I'll never forget my interactions with the lying figure enemy in the early parts of Silent Hill 2. The first time you see one it's scripted, but after that when the fog is so thick, and you hear what sounds like a wind-up toy and a really loud clanking sound, and you can't really see what it is, it's terrifying. A good example for Silent Hill 4 is the Wall Man. It makes a very loud crackling sound as it protrudes from the wall. It has a growl that you can hear from anywhere in the room, and there's usually more than one of them at a time, making for an interesting interaction. While I liked Henry's character, the direction given was to be quiet and reserved, so the player could more easily fill the shoes of the character. I think this direction ended up hurting the game. It severely dampened his reactions, making him feel less real or relatable. His voice delivery and lines were very weak, and lacked impact as if he weren't there at all. That hurt the immersion for me. I think all the other voice acting was pretty good. I have so much respect for the composer Akira Yamaoka. He's one of my favorite video game composers. He's skilled at both crafting traditional music with catchy melodies and creating more abstract music, with a focus on unique sounds over a strong melody. There are a lot of good tracks on this game's soundtrack, but I think back to when I was actually playing the game, and wondered when any of these songs actually played. Most of the game it was just silence and the sound of Henry's footsteps. The silence didn't work to strengthen any of the game's other elements either. It just left the game feeling empty. The game would have felt stronger and more immersive, with more stronger ambient music and sounds in the background. If I were to make a director's cut for Silent Hill 4, there are a lot of small things you could do that would make a huge difference. I would make the game much darker and bring back the flashlight. This is an easy change that would strengthen the atmosphere, and in turn the other elements of the game. I would fix the sound design of both the active monster noises and the passive environment noises to make them louder and more abstract. I would find more time to play music and add more environmental noises. Silence is supposed to be used so that when there is noise, it makes that much more of an impact. With stronger, louder, and more present sound design, it would further immerse you in the game. The game needs a subtle difficulty boost. Make the enemies more aggressive and the corridors in the level design more narrow. It would raise the tension and reaction needed to navigate without changing the core difficulty elements. I would add even more interactions, hauntings, and events in the room. The more things scripted to happen in the room, the more dynamic it starts to feel. You spend so much time going back and forth between the room, so the more events, the more fun and scary it gets. I would allow separate puzzle and combat difficulties. This will make the game more accessible and allow for more options. I would change the visuals so that your first trip through the area has the more normal locations, and warp that imagery into something rustier and more abstract, like the area seen in the past Silent Hill games. It's important to change the areas to defy the expectations of the players from their first trip. I would nerf how the room heals you as explained before. While I like the surprising changes to the game's second half regarding the room, it doesn't change how extremely useful being able to heal can be, and how much it hurts the survival horror aspect of the game. I would add high-tension boss fights to challenge the player and expend resources. Games like these need moments to craft unforgettable moments and test the player. I would rework the ghost enemies and ghost item mechanics to be more consistently useful and incentivize smart decision making. I like Silent Hill games because everything from the sound, music, visuals, enemies, and characters all work together and rely on each other in order to craft a unique, scary, oppressive, and memorable game. When one or more of these elements isn't strong, the other parts will suffer as well. You can see good ideas here in Silent Hill 4, but because it's lacking a strong foundation, everything starts to come apart. With weak sound design, environments, and mechanics, it starts to feel like a watered-down version of what came before it. I said a lot of good things about the game's ideas, but I also criticized it a lot. This is no masterpiece, but I'm still really glad I played it. Objectively, I think it's pretty average, but there were a lot of unique ideas underneath the surface worth talking about. I really admire the attempt to craft something new and different. Maybe if there was more time to polish the basic elements of the game, it could have been something truly special.